But what Daniel didn't know was that the elderly babysitter he was publicly humiliating actually owned the $1.2 million house he was living in rent-free. And the real estate empire I'd been quietly building for decades would soon teach him exactly why you should never mistake a mother's love for weakness or generosity for stupidity. Before we continue, tell us in the comments if you've ever been publicly humiliated by family. And if someone has ever taken your sacrifices for granted, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story of how one mother's quiet patience turned her son's cruelty into the most expensive lesson of his life will leave you absolutely speechless. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and at 72 years old, I thought I understood betrayal. I'd survived my husband William's sudden death from a heart attack 4 years ago, losing my partner of 45 years in a single devastating moment. I'd endured the painful process of selling Hartwell Interiors, the successful design firm I'd built from nothing over 30 years, to help my son Daniel through his expensive divorce and custody battle when his ex-wife decided motherhood was too limiting for her Instagram modeling career. I'd given up my beautiful downtown penthouse, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, where I'd hosted elegant dinner parties for clients and maintained the sophisticated lifestyle I'd earned through decades of hard work, to move into Daniel's guest house so I could help raise his twin daughters, Emma and Sophia, after their mother abandoned them for the bright lights of Los Angeles. But nothing in my 72 years of living, not financial struggles, not business betrayals, not even the crushing grief of widowhood, had prepared me for the cold, calculated humiliation I was about to experience at the Riverside Country Club on what should have been one of the happiest days of our family's life. The day had started before dawn, as most significant days do. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., not because of insomnia or anxiety, but because 7-year-old Emma had crawled into my bed at the guest house, trembling with excitement and nerves about her role as flower girl in Daddy's wedding. "Grandma Eleanor, what if I trip in front of all those people?" she'd whispered, her small fingers clutching the sleeve of my silk pajamas. "What if I forget to throw the petals? What if I embarrass Daddy on his special day?" I'd held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo, and whispered back the same reassurances I'd given her father when he was her age and worried about school presentations or little league games. "Sweetheart, you're going to be perfect. And even if something goes a little wrong, everyone will think you're adorable. That's the wonderful thing about being 7. People expect you to be charming, not perfect." Sophia had joined us 20 minutes later, equally nervous but trying to hide it behind the stoic bravery that reminded me so much of Daniel at that age. "I'm not scared," she'd announced, climbing into bed on my other side. "But Emma is, so I thought I should stay with her." The 3 of us had snuggled in my queen-sized bed, the modest one in the guest house, not the California king I'd had in my penthouse, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold while I told them stories about their grandfather, William. How nervous he'd been on our wedding day. How he'd practiced his vows so many times he could recite them in his sleep. "Was Daddy nervous when he married our first mommy?" Emma had asked. And I'd felt my heart clench at the casual way she referred to the woman who'd given birth to her as first mommy, as if mothers were interchangeable accessories rather than fundamental bonds. "A little," I'd admitted, though the truth was Daniel had been terrified during his first wedding, not about marrying Rebecca, but about whether he was ready for the responsibilities of family life. I'd spent the night before that wedding talking him through his fears, assuring him that love and commitment were more important than perfect preparation. How naive we'd both been. By 7 a.m., I was in the main house's kitchen, preparing the girls' favorite breakfast, Mickey Mouse pancakes with fresh strawberries and whipped cream, while Daniel and his bride-to-be, Cassandra Montgomery, dealt with the controlled chaos of wedding day preparations. The house was buzzing with activity. Hair and makeup artists setting up in the master bedroom, photographers capturing getting ready moments, florists making final adjustments to arrangements that had cost more than some people's monthly salaries. Moved through it all like a ghost, invisible to everyone except the children who needed me. When Emma spilled orange juice on her flower girl dress 2 hours before the ceremony, I was the one who quickly cleaned it and calmed her tears. When Sophia's hair ribbon kept slipping out of her fine hair, I was the one who found bobby pins and worked magic with hairspray until it stayed perfectly in place. The wedding dress arrival was a production worthy of Hollywood. Cassandra's gown, a custom creation that had reportedly cost $18,000, came with its own team of assistants and required 30 minutes just to get her into it properly. I watched from the hallway as photographers captured every moment of the process, everyone cooing over how stunning the bride looked, how perfect everything was, how this was definitely going to be featured in the society pages. "Mrs. Montgomery looks like a princess," Emma had whispered to me, eyes wide with wonder at the elaborate beading and 6-foot train that required 2 assistants to manage. "She certainly does," I'd agreed, though privately I thought the dress was more about making a statement than expressing joy. Every detail of this wedding seemed designed to impress rather than celebrate, to establish social status rather than begin a marriage. Daniel, meanwhile, was in his element as the center of attention. I watched him navigate the pre-ceremony chaos with the confidence of a man who felt he'd finally achieved the life he deserved. Gone was the uncertain young father who'd moved back into my guest house 3 years ago, devastated by his divorce and overwhelmed by single parenthood. In his place was someone who carried himself like he belonged among the Montgomery family's old money circles, like he'd been born to wear $1,000 tuxedos and host receptions at exclusive country clubs. The transformation wasn't entirely negative. I was proud that Daniel had rebuilt his confidence and found love again. Cassandra clearly made him happy in ways his first wife never had. She was intelligent, sophisticated, and genuinely affectionate with Emma and Sophia, which mattered more to me than any concerns about her motivations. But something about the way Daniel moved through his wedding day troubled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. There was a performance quality to his happiness, as if he were playing the role of successful groom rather than simply being one. Every smile seemed calculated for maximum photogenic impact, every gesture designed to convey the image of a man who'd overcome his humble beginnings to achieve something special. The ceremony itself was everything Cassandra had dreamed of, and everything she'd spent the past year planning with military precision. The Riverside Country Club's chapel was decorated with thousands of white roses and orchids, creating an atmosphere of elegant romance that would photograph beautifully for the social media posts I knew were already being planned. I sat in the odd 3rd row, not the front row where mothers traditionally sit, but close enough to watch Emma and Sophia perform their roles with the adorable seriousness that made every guest smile. They were perfect, of course. My beautiful granddaughters walking slowly down the rose-petal-strewn aisle, scattering flower petals with the concentration of surgeons performing delicate operations. Daniel's face when he saw them was genuine, joy, unmarred by performance or calculation. For a moment, I saw the man I'd raised, the father who would do anything for his daughters, who measured success by their happiness rather than social recognition. But the moment passed quickly as his attention shifted to his approaching bride, and the performance resumed. Cassandra was undeniably beautiful as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, elegant, composed, every inch the society bride she'd always planned to become. Robert Montgomery, her father, was distinguished in that particular way of men who'd inherited their wealth and spent their lives learning how to carry it gracefully. Patricia Montgomery, her mother, dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while managing to look perfectly put together despite her tears. The ceremony was traditional but personal, with vows that Daniel and Cassandra had written themselves. Daniel's were sweet and sincere, full of promises about building a life together and being the husband and stepfather his new family deserved. Cassandra's were elegant and thoughtful, acknowledging the challenges of blended families while expressing her commitment to loving not just Daniel, but Emma and Sophia as well. Listening to their promises, I felt a complex mixture of happiness and melancholy. Daniel deserved love and partnership after the devastation of his first marriage. The girls deserved a stable family with two parents who chose to be there. But I also felt the bittersweet recognition that this new chapter meant changes in our family dynamic that hadn't been fully discussed or defined. Where did I fit in Daniel's new life? What would my role be now that he had a wife who could provide the domestic stability and partnership he'd been lacking? These weren't selfish questions. I genuinely wanted Daniel to build an independent, successful life. But they were practical ones that affected my own future planning and emotional well-being. The reception was where the real performance began. The Riverside Country Club's ballroom had been transformed into something worthy of a magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers casting romantic light over tables, set with fine china and silver, elaborate floral centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a 7-piece orchestra that had played at some of the most exclusive events in the city's social calendar. This wasn't just a wedding reception. It was a debut, announcing Daniel and Cassandra's arrival in the upper echelons of local society. Every detail had been chosen to make a statement about their taste, their resources, and their rightful place among the city's elite families. I was seated at table 12, not table 1, where parents traditionally sit with the bride and groom. Not table 2, where immediate family members are honored. Table 12, in the back corner of the ballroom, with Daniel's colleagues from Hartwell Insurance. Decent, middle-class professionals who were clearly as surprised as I was to be attending. Such an elaborate affair. "Wow," whispered Janet Morrison, one of Daniel's co-workers, as she surveyed the opulent decorations. I had no idea Daniel could afford something like this. Insurance adjusting must pay better than I thought. I smiled non-committally, knowing that Daniel's salary, while respectable, couldn't begin to cover the costs of this reception. But I also knew that most of the guests assumed the Montgomery family was footing the bill, which allowed Daniel to enjoy the prestige without the financial stress. What Daniel didn't know, was that I'd quietly contributed $50,000 to the wedding expenses when he'd confided his anxiety about matching the Montgomery family's expectations. He thought the money had come from his savings and a small loan from his bank. In reality, it had come from the rental income on 3 properties I owned throughout the city. Properties Daniel had never bothered to ask about or investigate. The evening progressed with the usual wedding reception rituals. Cocktail hour with past hors d'oeuvres that were works of art in themselves, a dinner that showcased the country club's award-winning culinary team, and dancing that would continue well into the night. I watched it all from table 12, playing the role of gracious family friend while feeling increasingly invisible. When people asked who I was, Daniel's responses were vague and dismissive. "Family friend who helps with the kids," he'd say, or "someone who's been assisting with childcare. Never my mother, never the woman who raised me." Never any acknowledgement of our actual relationship or my sacrifices for his happiness. I watched him work the room with Cassandra, introducing her to his colleagues, accepting congratulations on their beautiful ceremony, playing the part of a successful young executive who'd won the lottery by marrying into such a distinguished family. He looked genuinely happy, and I was glad for that, even as I felt increasingly erased from his success story. The moment that shattered my heart completely came during the traditional reception speeches, when Daniel stood to thank the people who'd made their wedding day possible. I watched him take the microphone with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, scanning the room with a practiced smile that included everyone except me. "First, I want to thank my beautiful wife Cassandra for saying yes to spending the rest of her life with me," he began, his voice warm with genuine affection. "You've made me the luckiest man in the world, and I promise to spend every day proving that I deserve your love," the crowd murmured appreciatively. Cassandra glowed with happiness. her hand resting on her heart in a gesture that was both natural and perfectly photogenic. This was the moment every bride dreams of, being publicly celebrated by the man she loves in front of everyone who matters to them. I also want to thank my incredible new in-laws, Robert and Patricia Montgomery, for welcoming me into their family with such warmth and generosity, Daniel continued, raising his champagne glass toward the head table where the Montgomerys sat with obvious pride. Your daughter is extraordinary, and I know she learned her grace and kindness from watching both of you. The Montgomerys nodded graciously, clearly pleased with this public acknowledgement of their role in shaping the woman their son-in-law had married. Robert Montgomery stood briefly to acknowledge the tribute, his gesture encompassing both gratitude and approval of Daniel's respectful recognition. This incredible venue, these amazing vendors, this perfect evening, none of it would have been possible without the support of people who believed in us, Daniel went on, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed these remarks. Our wedding planner, Victoria, who turned Cassandra's dreams into reality, Chef Sebastian and his team, who've created a culinary experience we'll never forget. The staff here at Riverside Country Club, who've made every detail flawless. He paused to let the applause build, clearly enjoying his moment as the gracious host acknowledging the people who'd contributed to his special day. This was Daniel at his best, charming, appreciative, confident in a way that made people want to be around him. I also want to acknowledge some special people who've helped make this celebration possible, he continued, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe he would recognize me after all. Maybe he'd remember who'd supported him through his darkest days, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to help him rebuild his life. My beautiful daughters, Emma and Sophia, who've been so brave and excited about gaining a new mommy. You girls are the light of my life, and watching you walk down that aisle today made me the proudest daddy in the world. The crowd awed appropriately as Emma and Sophia waved from their special table near the front, where they'd been sitting with Cassandra's teenage nieces who'd been designated as their supervisors for the evening. They looked adorable and happy, basking in the attention and the sugar rush from their special desserts. And finally, Daniel said, his tone shifting slightly as he scanned the back of the room. I should mention Eleanor, just the babysitter who helps out with the kids. She's been invaluable in making sure Emma and Sophia were ready for their big day as flower girls. Just the babysitter. The words hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and devastating that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Around me, people smiled politely and applauded, having no idea they'd just witnessed a son publicly erasing his mother from his life story. Just the babysitter who helps out with the kids. I sat there in my carefully chosen navy blue dress, elegant, enough to be appropriate for a formal wedding, but understated enough not to draw attention from the bride, and felt something fundamental crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking exactly, but something deeper and more structural, like the foundation of a building developing a fault line that would eventually bring down the entire structure. The woman sitting next to me, Sandra Peterson, one of Daniel's insurance colleagues, leaned over with a sympathetic smile. How nice that he acknowledges the help, she whispered. Good babysitters are so hard to find these days, especially ones willing to work weekends for special events like this. Good babysitters are so hard to find. I managed to smile and nod, playing my assigned role as the appreciated domestic employee, while my mind reeled with the implications of what had just happened. Because Daniel wasn't confused about our relationship. He wasn't having a momentary lapse in judgment or struggling with wedding day nerves. He had deliberately, consciously, publicly reduced me from mother to hired help in front of 200 people who would now forever think of me as the elderly woman he employed to watch his children, the mother who'd given birth to him in a difficult labor that had nearly killed us both. The single parent who'd raised him after his father died of a sudden heart attack when Daniel was only 12 years old. The woman who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his college education, including weekend catering gigs that left me exhausted but determined to give him opportunities I'd never had. The business owner who'd sold her successful company to fund his divorce attorney when Rebecca decided motherhood was cramping her style. The grandmother who'd moved out of her beautiful penthouse to live in his guest house so she could help raise Emma and Sophia when their mother abandoned them. All of that history, all of those sacrifices, all of that love, reduced to just the babysitter who helps out with the kids. As the applause died down and Daniel moved on to thank his groomsmen for their support and friendship, I looked around table 12 at the faces of his colleagues. They were decent people. Sandra Peterson with her kind eyes and gentle manner. James Crawford, who always asked about my health when he saw me at company picnics. Maria Santos, who'd complimented my flower arrangements when I'd helped decorate the office for Christmas parties. But now they saw me as domestic staff rather than family. They probably thought I was a sweet elderly employee who was grateful to be included in such a fancy event, maybe even fortunate that my employer was generous enough to invite the help to his wedding reception. The conversation around our table shifted to admiration for the venue, speculation about the cost of such an elaborate affair, and gentle gossip about office politics at Hartwell Insurance. I participated politely, playing my assigned role while my mind worked furiously to process what had just happened and what it meant for my future relationship with my son. Because this wasn't just about public humiliation, though that was devastating. Enough. This was about Daniel's fundamental perception of my value and place in his life. He hadn't made a mistake or suffered a moment of poor judgment. He'd made a choice. A calculated decision to erase me from his success story, because acknowledging me as his mother might complicate the narrative he and Cassandra were crafting about their sophisticated, upwardly mobile lifestyle. The Daniel I'd raised would never have done such a thing. The boy who used to make me elaborate Mother's Day cards with construction paper, glitter, and heartfelt poems about how much he loved me would never have reduced me to hired help. The young man who'd cried in my arms after his father's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other would never have publicly humiliated the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his happiness. But that Daniel was gone, replaced by someone who could look his mother in the eye and call her just the babysitter, without apparent conscience or awareness of the cruelty he was inflicting. As I sat there listening to the rest of his speech, full of gratitude for his groomsmen's friendship, appreciation for his new wife's patience during the planning process, and excitement about their future together, I began to make mental calculations. Not emotional calculations about hurt feelings or damaged relationships, but practical financial calculations about property deeds, mortgage documents, and real estate investments that Daniel had never bothered to understand or investigate. Because what my ungrateful son didn't realize, what he'd never thought to ask about or appreciate, was that the babysitter he'd just dismissed owned not only the house he was living in, but a carefully curated portfolio of rental properties throughout the city that generated enough passive income to fund the very lifestyle he was so proudly displaying. The elegant colonial home where he'd brought his new bride, where he was raising his daughters, where he hosted dinner parties to impress Cassandra's sophisticated friends and colleagues. I owned it outright, had purchased it in cash 3 years ago when he'd needed a fresh start after his divorce, and had allowed him to live there rent-free while he got back on his feet, financially and emotionally. The monthly payments, he thought, were going toward his mortgage were actually going into savings accounts I'd established for Emma and Sophia's college funds. The property taxes, homeowners insurance, and maintenance costs he assumed were his responsibility were being quietly covered by rental income from the 4 other properties I owned throughout the metropolitan area. Daniel believed he was a successful homeowner, building equity and establishing himself as a stable provider for his new family. In reality, he was a tenant living in his mother's house through her generosity he'd just repaid by publicly humiliating her in front of everyone who mattered to his new wife's social circle. The irony was almost breathtaking in its completeness. The man who'd just introduced me as just the babysitter was living in a house I owned, driving a car whose payments I'd helped subsidize during his divorce, raising children whose expenses I quietly supplemented whenever his budget fell short, and hosting a wedding reception that I'd partially funded without his knowledge. But the most insulting part wasn't just being called the babysitter, devastating as that was. It was the casual dismissal of my sacrifices, the complete absence of gratitude or recognition for everything I'd given up to support his happiness and rebuild his life after Rebecca's abandonment. The successful interior design business I'd built over 30 years, sold to help fund his legal fees. The downtown penthouse I'd loved, given up to move into his guest house so I could help with childcare. The retirement I'd earned but postponed so I could be available when he needed me. The social life I'd maintained among successful professionals, my own age, abandoned so I could attend PTA meetings and soccer games and all the other obligations of surrogate motherhood. All of it reduced to helps out with the kids, as if I were a convenient service provider rather than his mother, as if my presence in his life were a business transaction rather than a labor of love. As the reception continued around me, guests dancing to the elegant orchestra, champagne flowing freely, Cassandra radiating satisfaction at her perfect society, wedding. I sat quietly at table 12 and began planning Daniel's education about the difference between having something and owning something, between appearing successful and actually being successful, between taking someone for granted and understanding their true value. The babysitter he'd just dismissed was about to give him the most expensive lesson of his life. And unlike the countless other lessons I'd taught him over the years, about honesty, respect, gratitude, and the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their role in your life, this one was going to cost him everything he thought he owned, because Eleanor Hartwell didn't build a real estate empire by accepting disrespect, even from her own son. And she certainly didn't sacrifice her entire life and financial security for an ungrateful child who could look her in the eye and reduce her to hired help in front of 200 people. The game was about to begin, and Daniel had no idea he was playing against a woman who'd been quietly acquiring assets and building wealth while he thought she was just helping out with the kids. By the time I was finished, he'd understand exactly what he'd lost when he chose his new wife's social approval over his mother's dignity. And he'd learn that some mistakes are too expensive to undo, even when you finally realize you've made them. The morning after Daniel's wedding, I sat in my small kitchen in the guest house, sipping coffee from my favorite ceramic mug, one of the few possessions I'd kept from my penthouse, and began making a list. Not a list of grievances or hurt feelings, though I had plenty of both, but a practical inventory of assets, investments, and business relationships that my son had never bothered to investigate or understand. Because to truly appreciate what Daniel had just thrown away with his casual cruelty, you need to understand who Eleanor Hartwell really was before she became just the babysitter in her son's eyes. You need to know about the empire I'd built from nothing, the fortune I'd accumulated through decades of strategic thinking, and the network of respect and influence I'd cultivated while Daniel was growing up, completely unaware that his mother was anything more than a devoted parent who happened to have a small interior design business. The story begins 48 years ago, when I was 24 years old and desperate enough to take any job that would pay the rent on our tiny apartment. William and I had been married for 2 years, both of us fresh out of college with liberal arts degrees that proved we could think but didn't qualify us for anything particularly lucrative. He was working as a junior accountant at a firm that paid him barely above minimum wage, and I was waitressing at an upscale restaurant while taking evening classes in business administration. We were young, broke, and optimistic in the way that only people who haven't yet discovered how expensive life can be. Our apartment was a cramped one-bedroom in a building that charitably could be called up and coming, though slowly deteriorating might have been more accurate. We shared a car that William needed for work, which meant I took 2 buses and walked 6 blocks to get to my waitressing job each night. But even in our financial struggles, I noticed things that other people seemed to miss. Like how the restaurant where I worked charged $30 for entrees that cost maybe $5 to prepare, simply because they'd created an atmosphere of elegant sophistication. Or how the wealthy customers who came in 3 nights that week always sat in the same sections, always ordered similar items, and always complained about the same details. The lighting was too bright, the music was too loud, the service was too slow. Most servers saw these complaints as annoyances to be endured. I saw them as business intelligence. These people have money to spend, I told William one night as we ate leftover pasta in our tiny kitchen. But they're not getting what they really want. They want to feel special, sophisticated, like they're part of something exclusive. The food is almost secondary. So what are you thinking? William asked, because even then he recognized when I was processing an idea that might change our circumstances. I'm thinking that someone who understood what they actually needed could build something really successful. Not just a restaurant, but an experience. Not just good food, but the feeling that you're important enough to deserve perfect service. William smiled the way he did when he was proud of my ambition but worried about our bank account. That sounds expensive to start. Everything worthwhile is expensive to start, I replied. The question is whether you're willing to invest in yourself or spend your whole life making other people rich. The opportunity came 6 months later, when Mrs. Helena Ashford, one of our restaurant's most demanding regulars, mentioned that she was renovating her downtown penthouse and couldn't find an interior designer who understood her vision. They keep showing me samples from catalogs, she complained over her usual order of Dover sole with a very specific wine pairing. I don't want what everyone else has. I want something that reflects my taste, my personality, my status. I want people to walk into my home and immediately understand that they're in the presence of someone who appreciates true quality. I was refilling her water glass when she said this, and without really thinking about the consequences, I found myself responding, what if someone could create that for you without using anything from a catalog? What if every piece was chosen specifically for how it would make you feel in your own space? Mrs. Ashford looked at me with the sharp attention she usually reserved for wine selections. Are you suggesting you could do that? The smart answer would have been no. I had no formal training in interior design, no portfolio of previous work, no business license or insurance, or any of the professional credentials that legitimate designers carried. I had a waitress uniform, a community college business degree, and an intuitive understanding of what made people feel important. I'm suggesting that I understand what you're looking for better than someone who's trying to apply a standard formula to your unique situation, I said, amazed at my own audacity. Give me 2 weeks and a small budget for samples, and I'll show you exactly what your home could become. Looking back, I can't believe Mrs. Ashford agreed to let an untested waitress redesign her 12,000-square-foot penthouse. But she was frustrated enough with traditional designers to take a chance on someone who seemed to truly understand her vision, and I was desperate enough to risk everything on a single opportunity. I spent every free moment of those 2 weeks researching, planning, and preparing. I visited furniture showrooms, fabric warehouses, and art galleries, not as a customer but as a student, learning about quality, craftsmanship, and the subtle details that separated truly exceptional pieces from expensive mediocrity. I measured Mrs. Ashford's space, studied the light patterns throughout different times of day, and analyzed how she moved through her rooms to understand her actual living patterns versus her stated preferences. Most importantly, I listened. Not just to what she said she wanted, but to what her complaints and comments revealed about how she saw herself and how she wanted others to see her. Mrs. Ashford wasn't just buying furniture. She was creating a stage set for the life she wanted, to live and the impression she wanted to make. The presentation I gave her was unlike anything a traditional interior designer would have provided. Instead of showing her pretty pictures and fabric samples, I told her a story about how each room would feel, how her guests would react, how she would experience her own home differently once it reflected her true sophistication and taste. When you enter your living room, I explained, walking her through spaces that existed only in my imagination but felt absolutely real in my description. The first thing people will notice isn't the furniture, it's the feeling of understated elegance. Everything will be beautiful, but nothing will be trying too hard to impress. Your guests will immediately relax because they'll sense they're in the presence of someone who has nothing to prove. Mrs. Ashford hired me on the spot, with a budget that represented more money than William and I had ever imagined having access to. But more than that, she became my first client testimonial, my entry point into a world of wealthy, sophisticated people who valued quality and were willing to pay for expertise. The renovation took 4 months and exceeded every expectation Mrs. Ashford had articulated. But more importantly, it exceeded expectations she hadn't even known she had. I'd created spaces that weren't just beautiful but psychologically satisfying, rooms that made her feel like the sophisticated, cultured woman she'd always wanted to be. Eleanor, she told me at the completion party she hosted to show off her transformed home. You didn't just redecorate my penthouse. You helped me become the person I was meant to be in my own space. That's not interior design. That's magic. Magic. That was the word that would define my career for the next 30 years, though the magic was really just careful observation, strategic thinking, and an intuitive understanding of what people needed to feel successful and satisfied in their own environments. Mrs. Ashford's party became my unofficial portfolio launch. Every guest who attended saw not just beautiful rooms, but the evidence of transformation, how the right design choices could enhance someone's lifestyle, elevate their daily experience, and reflect their true personality in ways that impressed others while satisfying themselves. By the end of that evening, I had 6 potential clients asking for consultations. Within a month, I had 3 signed contracts. Within a year, I'd established Hartwell Interiors as one of the city's most sought-after residential design firms, specializing in what I called lifestyle transformation through environmental design. The business model was simple but revolutionary. Instead of imposing design trends or pushing specific products, I studied each client as thoroughly as I studied their spaces, creating environments that reflected their authentic personalities, while enhancing their natural strengths and minimizing their insecurities. For Mrs. Caroline Bennett, a newly divorced socialite who felt insecure about entertaining after her husband's very public affair, I created a dining room that made intimate dinner parties feel like exclusive events. The space was designed to accommodate 6 to 8 people comfortably, with lighting and acoustics that encouraged conversation, and a layout that made the hostess feel confident and in control. For Mr. Richard Hayes, a successful but introverted businessman who needed to entertain clients at home but felt uncomfortable in social situations, I designed a study that functioned as both a private retreat and an impressive meeting space. The room conveyed success and sophistication while providing him with subtle psychological supports, a commanding desk position, strategic lighting that favored him during conversations, and conversation pieces that gave him easy topics to discuss. When social small talk felt challenging, each project taught me more about the psychology of space, the relationship between environment and confidence, and the ways that thoughtful design could actually improve people's lives rather than just making their homes prettier. I wasn't just decorating rooms, I was solving problems, addressing insecurities, and helping people become more successful versions of themselves. The financial success followed naturally. When you're genuinely improving people's lives, they're happy to pay premium prices and refer their friends. Within 5 years, Hartwell Interiors was generating over $500,000 annually. Within 10 years, we were approaching $1 million in annual revenue, with a waiting list of clients that stretched 6 months out. But the real breakthrough came when I began to understand real estate not just as spaces to be designed, but as investments to be acquired. I noticed that many of my wealthiest clients owned multiple properties, not just their primary residences, but vacation homes, rental properties, and investment holdings that generated passive income and appreciated in value over time. Eleanor, explained Mr. James Patterson, a client who'd hired me to design his fourth property in the city, the secret to real wealth isn't making more money, it's making your money work for you. I buy properties in neighborhoods that are improving, fix them up to attract quality tenants, and let the rental income pay the mortgages while the properties appreciate. In 10 years, I'll own them outright and have assets worth millions. That conversation changed my perspective on business entirely. Instead of just earning money from design projects, I began studying real estate markets, learning about property, investment strategies, and looking for opportunities to apply my understanding of what people wanted in their living spaces to identify undervalued properties with potential. My first investment property was a tired Victorian duplex in what was then considered a marginal neighborhood, but which I recognized as being on the cusp of gentrification. Young professionals were starting to move in, attracted by the character architecture and reasonable prices, but most of the existing properties were poorly maintained and unappealing to potential renters who could afford higher rents. I bought the duplex for $85,000, spent another $40,000 on renovations that combined period charm with modern conveniences, and transformed it into 2 elegant apartments that rented for substantially more than comparable units. In the area, the total investment was $125,000, but the property generated enough rental income to cover the mortgage payments and provide additional cash flow while appreciating rapidly as the neighborhood continued to improve. More importantly, the project taught me that my design skills weren't just valuable for wealthy clients. They were incredibly valuable for creating rental properties that could command premium rents from tenants who appreciated quality and attention to detail. Over the next 15 years, I carefully acquired 7 more properties using this same strategy. Identify neighborhoods with potential, buy properties that needed cosmetic improvement rather than major structural work, apply my design expertise to create spaces that tenants would love and maintain well, and rent them to professionals who valued quality enough to pay appropriately for it. By the time Daniel graduated from college, I owned 8 rental properties throughout the metropolitan area, each generating positive cash flow and appreciating steadily in value. The combined rental income was substantial enough that I could have stopped working entirely if I'd chosen to, though I continued running Hartwell Interiors because I genuinely loved the creative and psychological challenges of helping people improve their lives through better living environments. But here's what Daniel never understood, never bothered to investigate, and certainly never appreciated. Everything I was building was being built for him. The business success, the property investments, the carefully accumulated wealth, all of it was my way of ensuring that my son would never experience the financial insecurity that William and I had endured in our early years together. When Daniel was 16 and worried about college costs, I was already generating enough rental income to pay his entire education without touching our savings. When he was 22 and uncertain about his career direction, I had enough financial cushion to support him through job transitions and professional development without stress. When he was 28 and devastated by his divorce, I could sell my business to fund his legal fees without endangering my own financial security, because the real estate portfolio was generating enough passive income to support my lifestyle indefinitely. Everything I'd built was designed to give Daniel freedom to choose meaningful work over high-paying drudgery, freedom to recover from setbacks without devastating consequences, freedom to be a good father without sacrificing his own dreams or stability. The interior design business that Daniel thought of as Mom's little decorating hobby had generated over $15 million in revenue during its 30-year existence. The small inheritance he assumed I'd received when William died was actually a carefully managed investment portfolio worth over $2 million. The modest savings he thought I was living on were actually the proceeds from selling Hartwell Interiors to my longtime business manager, Patricia Caldwell, for $1.8 million. money I'd use to expand my real estate holdings and establish trust funds for Emma and Sophia's education. But the crown jewel of my financial empire, the asset that Daniel was completely unaware of, was the property portfolio that now included 12 rental units generating over $38,000 monthly in gross rental income. After expenses, taxes, and property management fees, the net income was still substantial enough to fund a very comfortable lifestyle while continuing to invest in additional properties. The beautiful colonial house that Daniel thought he owned, where he'd brought his new bride and hosted his elegant wedding reception. I'd purchased it 3 years ago for $1.2 million in cash when he'd needed a fresh start after his divorce. The monthly payments he thought were going toward his mortgage were actually being deposited into educational savings accounts I'd established for his daughters. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance costs, landscaping, snow removal, major repairs, all of it paid for through my rental income while Daniel believed he was shouldering these responsibilities himself. He was living rent-free in a house worth over $1.4 million in today's market, raising his children in comfort and security that I was providing, building his new marriage on a foundation of financial stability that existed entirely through my generosity. And yesterday, at his wedding reception, he'd introduced me as just the babysitter who helps out with the kids. The irony was so complete, it was almost artistic. The woman he'd dismissed as hired help owned not only his house, but a real estate empire that could have funded 10 weddings like the one where he'd humiliated me. The babysitter he'd relegated to table 12 had more liquid assets than most of the guests who'd been seated at the head table with the Montgomery family. But beyond the financial holdings that Daniel didn't know about, there was something even more valuable that he'd never bothered to recognize or appreciate. The network of professional relationships I'd built over 3 decades of successful business operation. Patricia Caldwell, who'd bought Hartwell Interiors, had expanded it into a multi-million-dollar firm specializing in commercial and residential design. She still called me for advice on challenging projects and considered me a mentor and friend, rather than just a former business owner. Marcus Richardson, who'd started as a carpenter on my renovation projects and now owned the largest high-end construction company in the city, still gave me priority scheduling whenever I needed work done on my properties. He credited his success to lessons he'd learned working on my early projects about attention to detail and client satisfaction. Linda Torres, who'd been my office manager for 15 years before leaving to start her own property management company, now managed 8 of my 12 rental properties and consistently delivered the kind of professional service that kept my tenants happy and my vacancy rates virtually non-existent. These weren't just business contacts. They were people who respected my judgment, valued my expertise, and would be eager to work with me again if I decided to return to active business operation. They remembered how I'd treated employees, how I'd honored contracts, how I'd built success through integrity rather than exploitation. More importantly, they understood something that Daniel had apparently forgotten. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't someone you dismissed casually. She was someone you treated with respect, not because you had to, but because she'd earned it through decades of competent, ethical, successful business operation. The morning after Daniel's wedding, as I sat in my small kitchen making lists and drinking coffee, I wasn't planning revenge in the traditional sense. I was planning education, a comprehensive course in the difference between having something and owning something, between appearing successful and actually being successful, between taking someone for granted and understanding their true value, because my ungrateful son was about to learn that the babysitter he'd dismissed had options he'd never imagined, resources he'd never investigated, and the kind of strategic thinking that had built empires while he was playing house in someone else's property. The first call I made was to Patricia Caldwell. "Eleanor," Patricia's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "How was the wedding? I hope Daniel appreciated everything you did to make it special." "The wedding was lovely," I said, which was true even if the aftermath had been devastating. "Patricia, I'm calling because I'm thinking about returning to active business operation. Not interior design necessarily, but something that would use my skills and experience in new ways. That's wonderful news, Patricia said immediately. You've been missed in the industry. What kind of venture are you considering? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But I'd like to explore opportunities that would allow me to work with people who appreciate expertise and treat professionals with respect. I think I've spent enough time in situations where my contributions weren't properly valued. Patricia, who'd worked with me long enough to read between the lines, made a sympathetic sound. Family can be challenging sometimes, she said diplomatically. But Eleanor, if you're serious about returning to business, I'd love to discuss some collaboration opportunities. The market has changed since you sold, but there's still enormous demand for the kind of thoughtful, client-focused work you were known for. The second call was to Marcus Richardson. Mrs. Hartwell! Marcus's voice boomed with the enthusiasm that had made him one of the most successful contractors in the city. Perfect timing. I was just thinking about you. I'm working on a project that could really use your input on space planning and design integration. Actually, Marcus, I'm calling because I'm considering some new business ventures and wanted to understand current market conditions for renovation and development projects. Well, business is booming, Marcus said. There's huge demand for quality work, especially in the residential market. Properties that are renovated thoughtfully can see tremendous appreciation, particularly if someone really understands how to maximize both functionality and appeal. What about investment opportunities? I asked. Are you seeing projects where someone with capital and design expertise could partner with experienced contractors on development or renovation ventures? Absolutely, Marcus replied without hesitation. In fact, I've been looking for an investor partner who understands the high-end residential market. Someone who could help identify properties with potential and oversee the design aspects while I handle construction management. The profit margins can be substantial if you know what you're doing. The third call was to Linda Torres. Eleanor, what a surprise, Linda said. How are you? I heard through the grapevine that Daniel got married this weekend. That must have been exciting. It was certainly eventful, I replied. Linda, I'm calling because I'm thinking about expanding my property holdings and wanted to get your perspective on current rental markets and management opportunities. The market is incredibly strong right now, Linda said immediately. Demand for quality rental properties is higher than I've ever seen, especially for units that offer something special in terms of design or amenities. Properties like yours consistently rent above market rate because tenants recognize the difference between ordinary apartments and spaces that have been created with real thought and care. What about larger-scale opportunities? I asked. Multi-unit, buildings, renovation projects, maybe even small-scale development? There's enormous potential there, Linda said. I have several clients who've made fortunes buying tired properties, renovating them properly, and either renting them at premium rates or selling them to buyers who appreciate quality. The key is having someone who understands both the financial aspects and the design elements that create real value. By noon, I had a clearer picture of the opportunities available to someone with my resources, skills, and professional network. The real estate market was strong. Demand for quality renovation work was high, and there were multiple paths back to active business operation that could be both financially rewarding and personally satisfying. But more importantly, I had confirmation that Eleanor Hartwell was still respected in her professional community, that people remembered her work and valued her expertise, and that she had access to opportunities that could generate substantial wealth while providing the kind of meaningful challenge she'd always thrived on. Daniel thought he'd married into sophistication and status by wedding Cassandra Montgomery. He had no idea that his mother had been operating at that level of financial success for decades, choosing to live modestly and support his dreams rather than displaying her own wealth and accomplishments. He thought he was building an impressive life through his insurance career and his connection to the Montgomery family's social circle. He didn't realize that the foundation of his stability, his house, his financial security, his ability to provide for his daughters, existed entirely through his mother's strategic generosity. Most crucially, he thought he could dismiss me as just the babysitter without consequences, as if I were a service provider with no options, rather than a successful businesswoman who'd chosen to prioritize his welfare over my own recognition. That afternoon, I drove through the city looking at properties for sale, analyzing neighborhoods with potential, and beginning to envision the business empire I could build if I decided to stop being invisible and start being the formidable entrepreneur I'd always been. Daniel was about to learn that some people can't be dismissed as easily as he'd assumed, and he was about to discover that when you take someone's generosity for granted, you risk losing access to resources you didn't even know you were depending on. The babysitter was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. To understand the full depth of Daniel's betrayal at his wedding reception, you need to see what our relationship was like before Cassandra's influence transformed my loving, grateful son into a stranger who could introduce his mother as just the babysitter without apparent conscience. You need to understand the foundation of love, mutual respect, and shared values that had been built over decades, and how completely it had been demolished in the pursuit of social status and acceptance into the Montgomery family's world. The Daniel Y raised wasn't born selfish or calculating. Dismissiveness wasn't in his character, and cruelty toward family wasn't part of his nature. The boy who grew up in our modest two-bedroom apartment after his father died had been kind, grateful, and deeply aware of the sacrifices his mother was making to give him opportunities she'd never had. But let me take you back to who we really were, before ambition poisoned love, and before my son learned to see his mother as an obstacle to his social advancement, rather than the woman who'd built the foundation for every success he'd ever achieved. The transformation of our relationship hadn't happened overnight. For the first 38 years of Daniel's life, we'd been not just mother and son, but genuine partners in building something meaningful from the wreckage of unexpected tragedy. When William died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving me a 34-year-old widow with a 12-year-old son and a struggling interior design business, Daniel and I had made a conscious choice to face our challenges together rather than separately. "We're a team now, sweetheart," I'd told him the night after William's funeral, when Daniel had crawled into my bed because his own room felt too empty and quiet. "It's going to be hard sometimes, but we're going to take care of each other. That's what families do when things get difficult." Daniel had looked at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his 12-year-old face and said, "I want to help, Mom. I want to do whatever I can to make things easier for you." That conversation became the foundation of our relationship for the next 26 years. We weren't just mother and son. We were partners who understood that our success and happiness were interconnected, that what benefited one of us ultimately benefited both of us, and that family loyalty wasn't just a sentiment, but a practical strategy for building a better life together. In those early years after William's death, Daniel kept his promise to help in ways that still amaze me when I remember them. While other 12-year-old boys were playing video games or hanging out with friends after school, Daniel was coming home to help with household management, so I could focus on building Hartwell Interiors into something that could support our family's future. He learned to do his own laundry, prepare simple meals, and maintain our apartment to standards that would have impressed a professional housekeeper. Not because I demanded it or because we couldn't afford help, but because he understood that every hour he saved me on domestic tasks was an hour I could spend earning money or developing client relationships that would improve our long-term security. "Mrs. Patterson called about changing her consultation to Thursday," Daniel would report when I came home from client meetings, reading from the careful notes he'd taken while managing my business phone. "And the fabric samples for the Morrison project arrived. I put them on your desk so you could review them tonight." At 12 years old, Daniel was functioning as my unpaid assistant, receptionist, and household manager. And he did it all with the kind of pride and dedication that, most adults bring to jobs they're passionate about. He wasn't just helping his mother, he was contributing to our family's success in ways that felt meaningful and important to him. Some of my most treasured memories from that period center around our Sunday planning sessions, when Daniel and I would sit at our small kitchen table with my business calendar, his school schedule, and our household budget, coordinating everything like the efficient team we'd become. "You have 3 client consultations next week," Daniel would observe, studying my appointment book with the seriousness of a professional scheduler. "Mrs. Ashford on Tuesday, Mr. Hayes on Thursday, and the new client, Mrs. Bennett, on Saturday. Morning. Do you need me to reorganize anything on my end to help with preparation?" These weren't conversations between a parent and child. They were strategy sessions between partners who respected each other's contributions and understood that our individual successes depended on our collective organization and mutual support. Daniel took genuine pride in Hartwell Interior's growth during those years. When I landed a particularly prestigious client or completed a project that generated significant revenue, he celebrated as enthusiastically as I did, because he understood that my professional success meant security and opportunities for both of us. "Mom," Mrs. Davidson called to say the Patterson family loved what you did with their dining room and wants to hire you for their summer house, he'd announce with the kind of excitement that other kids reserved for Christmas morning. She said they've never had so many compliments on their entertaining space. Daniel understood something that many adults never grasp, that family members' achievements reflect on everyone in the family, that supporting each other's success creates a rising tide that lifts everyone's boat, and that celebrating others' accomplishments is both a responsibility and a privilege of genuine love. The summer Daniel turned 15, he asked if he could work as my official assistant during his school vacation, helping with project coordination, client communication, and site supervision for renovation projects. I was hesitant at first, not because I doubted his capabilities, but because I wanted him to have normal teenage experiences rather than spending his entire summer in adult work environments. "Mom," he'd said with the kind of earnest determination that had characterized his approach to everything since his father's death. "Other kids my age are working at fast food restaurants or retail stores, learning nothing except how to follow orders and deal with difficult customers. Working with you, I'd learn about business, design, client relations, project management, skills that could actually help me build a successful career someday." He was right, of course. Daniel spent that summer learning more about professional success than most people learn in their first decade of employment. He attended client meetings, observing how I listened to concerns, addressed objections, and guided decisions without being pushy or manipulative. He supervised delivery crews, learning how to coordinate logistics while maintaining quality standards. He even helped with design research, developing an eye for quality and craftsmanship that would serve him well throughout his life. But more importantly, that summer taught Daniel about the relationship between hard work and achievement, between attention to detail and professional reputation, between treating people well and building the kind of business relationships that sustain long-term success. "I understand now why your clients always come back to you," he'd told me at the end of that summer. "It's not just because you're talented at design. It's because you make them feel like their happiness actually matters to you. You're not just selling them furniture. You're helping them create the life they want to live." At 15, Daniel had developed insights about business, psychology, and client relations that some professionals never master. But more than that, he'd learned to see his mother not just as a parent, but as a successful entrepreneur whose skills and achievements were worthy of respect and admiration. The teenage years brought their own challenges, as they do for every family, but Daniel never lost his fundamental understanding that we were partners in building something meaningful together. When other teenagers were rebelling against parental authority or testing boundaries through destructive behavior, Daniel was channeling his independence drive into constructive contributions to our family's continued success. During his junior year of high school, when I was struggling to balance a particularly demanding client load with his increasing activities and academic pressures, Daniel proposed creating a formal division of responsibilities that would allow me to focus on my highest value work while he managed more of our household logistics. "You're spending too much time on things that don't require your specific expertise," he'd observed with the analytical thinking that had always impressed his teachers. "Grocery shopping, appointment scheduling, basic maintenance coordination, I can handle all of that efficiently, which frees you up for design work and client development." We formalized the arrangement with a written agreement that outlined his responsibilities and the allowance he'd receive for essentially functioning as our family's operations manager. But Daniel approached the role with professional seriousness that went far beyond what any allowance could motivate. He researched vendors, negotiated better rates for services like lawn care and house cleaning, and developed systems for managing our household expenses that were more sophisticated than what many small businesses use. He coordinated my schedule to minimize travel time between appointments, prepared briefing materials for important client meetings, and even learned basic bookkeeping so he could help with invoicing and expense tracking. "Mom, I've been thinking about your client retention strategies," he'd announce over dinner, as if he were a business consultant rather than a high school student. "You do incredible work for people, but you're not systematic about staying in touch with past clients who might need additional services or referrals. I think we should develop a follow-up protocol that keeps Hartwell Interiors top of mind for future projects." Daniel was 17 years old, discussing customer relationship management strategies with the sophistication of someone who'd studied business for decades. But more importantly, he was thinking about our success as shared success, approaching my business challenges as if they were his own challenges, because in his mind, they were. The college years tested our partnership in new ways, but they also demonstrated the strength of the foundation we'd built together. Daniel chose to attend the state university, partly because the quality of their business program was excellent, but mostly because staying local meant he could continue contributing to Hartwell Interiors during summers and holiday breaks. "I know I could get into more prestigious schools," he'd explained when discussing his college applications, "but those degrees are really just expensive ways to learn things I'm already learning by working with you. Plus, why would I want to be thousands of miles away from the most successful entrepreneur I know?" During his freshman year, Daniel actually helped me land one of the largest projects in Hartwell Interiors history by leveraging relationships he'd developed through campus activities. The university's Alumni Association was planning a major renovation of their event spaces, and Daniel had mentioned the project to me after attending a student leadership meeting where the challenges were discussed. "The committee is frustrated because all the design firms they've consulted have proposed cookie-cutter solutions that don't reflect the university's unique character or the diverse ways the spaces need to function," Daniel had reported. "They want something that feels both elegant and welcoming, sophisticated but not intimidating, flexible enough for different types of events, but with a coherent aesthetic identity." "That sounds like exactly the kind of challenge your mother loves," I'd replied, already beginning to envision solutions that could address their complex requirements. Daniel arranged an introduction, attended the initial consultation to provide insights about the university community's culture and needs, and even helped prepare the presentation that won us the contract. The project generated over $200,000 in revenue for Hartwell Interiors and led to several additional institutional clients who'd seen our work on campus. "Mom, I'm so proud of what we accomplished with this project," Daniel had said when the renovation was completed to unanimous praise from the university administration. "But I'm even more proud that people are starting to understand what I've always known, that you're not just talented, you're brilliant at solving problems that other people can't even see clearly." Daniel was 20 years old, speaking about our professional collaboration with genuine pride and respect. He didn't see himself as my assistant or helper. He saw himself as my junior partner in building something meaningful that reflected both of our contributions and capabilities. The graduation ceremony when Daniel received his business degree was one of the proudest moments of my life, not just because of his academic achievement, but because of the speech he gave as the student speaker for his graduating class. Success isn't just about individual accomplishment, he'd told an audience of hundreds of families and faculty members. It's about recognizing that everything we achieve is built on foundations that other people helped create. My mother taught me that the most successful businesses aren't just profitable, they're businesses that create value for everyone they touch. Employees, clients, communities, families. Success should lift everyone up, not just the person whose name is on the door. As I sat in that auditorium listening to my son articulate values I'd tried to model throughout his life, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've successfully passed on something important to the next generation. Daniel understood that success was about contribution rather than accumulation, about building rather than taking, about recognizing and honoring the people who make your achievements possible. Most importantly, Daniel had continued, looking directly at me from the podium, I learned that the greatest privilege in life is having people who believe in your potential enough to sacrifice for your opportunities. My mother sold her dream house to pay for my education, worked extra projects to ensure I could focus on my studies, and taught me by example that love isn't just a feeling. It's a commitment to putting other people's success ahead of your own comfort. The entire auditorium had erupted in applause, but I'd barely heard it through my tears of pride and love. This was my son, grateful, wise, generous, understanding that his achievements were built on a foundation of love and sacrifice that deserved recognition and honor. Daniel's early career years were marked by the same partnership and mutual support that had characterized our relationship since his father's death. When he graduated and started his first job as a junior claims adjuster at Hartwell Insurance, he was living in my guest house not because he couldn't afford his own place, but because we both enjoyed the continuation of our close collaboration and daily interaction. Why would I want to live alone in some sterile apartment when I can stay here and keep learning from the smartest businesswoman I know? He'd explained when friends questioned why a college graduate was still living with his mother. Plus, Mom's building an addition to her property portfolio, and I'm getting to observe real estate investment strategies from someone who's actually successful at it. During this period, Daniel functioned almost as my informal business consultant, helping me analyze potential property acquisitions, research market trends, and develop improvement strategies for my rental units. His business degree, combined with years of practical experience working with Hartwell Interiors, made him an invaluable advisor for the expansion of my real estate holdings. Mom, I've been researching the Riverside neighborhood where you're considering that duplex purchase, he'd report after spending his evenings analyzing demographic data and development patterns. The city planning department has approved 3 major infrastructure improvements that should increase property values significantly over the next 5 years. I think you should definitely move forward with the acquisition. These weren't conversations between a dependent adult child and a parent providing housing. They were strategy sessions between partners who respected each other's expertise and enjoyed collaborating on projects that benefited both of them. When Daniel met Rebecca, his first wife, I was genuinely happy for him. He deserved love and companionship, and Rebecca seemed to make him happy in ways that were wonderful to witness. She was beautiful, vivacious, and appropriately impressed by Daniel's intelligence and ambition. But from the beginning, I noticed subtle differences in how Daniel talked about his goals and priorities when Rebecca was around. Instead of discussing real estate investment strategies or business development opportunities, conversations shifted toward more conventional markers of success: salary advancement, social status, consumer purchases that would signal his professional advancement. Rebecca thinks I should focus on getting promoted to senior adjuster as quickly as possible, Daniel would mention during our Sunday planning sessions. She says building a strong income foundation should be the priority before we start thinking about investment strategies or side projects. Building a strong income foundation wasn't bad advice, but it represented a shift from the long-term thinking that had always characterized Daniel's approach to career development. Instead of viewing his job as one component of a comprehensive, wealth-building strategy, he was beginning to see it as the primary source of his identity and security. When Daniel and Rebecca married, I welcomed her into our family with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. I helped plan their wedding, contributed financially to ensure they could celebrate appropriately, and made every effort to include Rebecca in our family traditions and decision-making processes. I want you to feel like this is your family too, I'd told Rebecca during one of our early conversations about their future plans. Daniel and I have always been a team, and now we're a team of 3. Whatever you need to feel supported and valued here, please let me know. Rebecca had seemed appreciative of my efforts to include her, and for the first few years of their marriage, our family dynamic remained positive and collaborative. When Emma and Sophia were born, I was thrilled to become a grandmother and eager to help with childcare and support however I could be useful. But the cracks in Rebecca's commitment to family life became apparent when the girls were still toddlers. Instead of finding fulfillment in motherhood, Rebecca seemed increasingly restless and resentful of the responsibilities that came with raising children. She talked constantly about her pre-marriage modeling career, about opportunities she was missing, about the limitations that family life imposed on her personal ambitions. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she'd complain during family dinners, while Emma and Sophia played happily nearby. "I used to be someone interesting, someone with potential. Now I'm just a mother and wife, and that's not enough for me." The comment stung, not because Rebecca didn't have a right to her own dreams and ambitions, but because she seemed to view motherhood and marriage as obstacles to meaningful achievement rather than meaningful achievements in themselves. Daniel, desperate to save his marriage and make Rebecca happy, began talking about ways they could restructure their lives to give her more freedom to pursue her modeling career. "Maybe we could hire more help with the girls," he'd suggest. "Or I could take on more of the household responsibilities so Rebecca could travel for photo shoots and auditions." I watched my son twist himself into knots trying to accommodate a wife who seemed fundamentally unwilling to embrace the life they'd chosen together. But I also tried to be supportive of their efforts to find a balance that would work for everyone involved. The end came suddenly, with a cruelty that still takes my breath away when I remember it. Rebecca announced that she'd been offered a modeling contract in Los Angeles. Not a major opportunity that would justify temporary family separation, but a modest prospect that would require her to relocate permanently and leave her husband and daughters behind. "I need to follow my dreams while I still can," she'd explained to Daniel, as if abandoning your children was a reasonable career development strategy. "The girls will be fine with you, and this is my chance to build the life I was meant to live." Daniel was devastated. Not just by Rebecca's decision to leave, but by her casual dismissal of their daughter's emotional needs and her apparent lack of concern for the family she was destroying. He begged her to reconsider, offered to relocate with her, suggested compromise solutions that could keep their family together. Rebecca's response was to pack her belongings, drain their joint savings account, and leave for Los Angeles without even saying goodbye to Emma and Sophia properly. She said goodbyes would just make things harder for everyone, Daniel had told me through tears that seemed to come from his soul. She said the girls were young enough that they'd adjust quickly to her being gone. Daniel's pain during this period was excruciating to witness. He'd built his entire adult life around the assumption that love and commitment were reciprocal, that family bonds were strong enough to survive challenges, that people who promised to be partners actually honored those promises when circumstances became difficult. Rebecca's abandonment shattered those assumptions and left Daniel questioning everything he'd believed about love, marriage, and the possibility of building lasting relationships with people who claim to share your values. "Mom, how do you ever trust someone again after something like this?" he'd asked during one of our late-night conversations in the weeks after Rebecca left. "How do you believe that anyone will actually stick around when things get hard?" You trust again because the alternative is living in fear, I'd told him, holding him while he cried like the heartbroken child he'd become despite being 28 years old. And you build relationships with people who demonstrate through their actions that they understand love is about commitment, not just feelings. The months following Rebecca's departure were when Daniel and I became closest as adults. He moved back into my guest house with Emma and Sophia, and we recreated the partnership that had sustained us through his father's death and my early business-building years. I helped with childcare while he processed his grief and adjusted to single parenthood. He helped me with property management and business planning, while I provided the emotional support he needed to rebuild his confidence and self-worth. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Mom," Daniel had told me during one of our Sunday planning sessions, which had evolved to include coordinating Emma and Sophia's schedules along with our business and household responsibilities. "You've been my anchor through all of this. I can't imagine facing it alone." "You'll never have to face anything alone as long as I'm here," I'd promised him, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "We're partners, remember? We take care of each other." Those were the best years of our adult relationship, Daniel, Emma, Sophia, and I functioning as a close-knit family unit that balanced individual needs with collective well-being. Daniel threw himself into being an excellent father while rebuilding his emotional resilience. I enjoyed being a hands-on grandmother, while continuing to expand my real estate investments. Emma and Sophia thrived in an environment filled with love, attention, and the security that comes from being surrounded by adults who prioritize children's welfare over their own convenience. Daniel during this period was everything I'd raised him to be: grateful, generous, family-focused, understanding that success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about creating stable, loving environments where everyone could flourish. He talked about his goals in terms of what would benefit Emma and Sophia, what would honor his father's memory, what would continue building on the foundation of values that had sustained our family through every challenge we'd faced. "I want to be the kind of father to Emma and Sophia that Dad was to me," Daniel would say when discussing his parenting philosophy. "Someone who shows them that love isn't just words, it's daily choices to put their welfare ahead of your own. Convenience. And I want to be the kind of son to you that honors everything you've sacrificed for our family," he'd add. "You gave up your dreams to ensure I had opportunities, and I want my success to reflect the values you taught me." This was my son at his best: wise, grateful, committed to family, understanding that individual achievement meant nothing if it came at the expense of the people who'd made that achievement possible. But this was also the son who, 5 years later, would stand at his wedding reception and introduce me as just the babysitter who helps out with the kids. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it wasn't the result of deliberate cruelty on Daniel's part. It was the gradual erosion of values that occurs when someone begins measuring their worth by external validation rather than internal integrity, when they start caring more about impressing strangers than honoring the people who love them unconditionally. Understanding what we'd been makes Daniel's betrayal at his wedding infinitely more painful. He hadn't just dismissed a helpful elderly relative or casual family friend. He'd publicly humiliated the woman who'd been his partner, mentor, and anchor through every significant challenge of his life. He'd reduced 38 years of love, sacrifice, and mutual support to a casual employment relationship, as if everything we'd built together meant nothing more than a convenient childcare arrangement. The Daniel I'd raised would never have done such a thing. The grateful son who'd credited his success to his mother's sacrifices would never have dismissed her as hired help in front of 200 strangers. The man who'd promised to honor our partnership would never have chosen social acceptance over family loyalty. But that Daniel was gone, replaced by someone who could look his mother in the eye and erase her from his success story without apparent conscience or recognition of what he was throwing away. As I sat in my guest house the morning after his wedding, making lists and planning my response to his public humiliation, I wasn't just angry about being called the babysitter. I was grieving the death of a relationship that had been the most meaningful partnership of my life. The loss of a son who'd forgotten that everything he was had been built on the foundation of his mother's love. Daniel was about to learn what happens when you take that foundation for granted. And he was about to discover that some relationships, once broken, can never be rebuilt exactly as they were before. Cassandra Montgomery entered our lives on a crisp October evening in 2019, 2 years after Daniel's divorce had been finalized, and 3 years into the period when our family had found its rhythm as a close-knit unit of 4. She arrived at our front door carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and wearing the kind of effortless elegance that comes from growing up with money, connections, and the absolute confidence that the world will arrange itself around your preferences. "You must be Eleanor," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand that had clearly never scrubbed floors or changed diapers. "Daniel has told me so much about you. I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who raised such an exceptional man." The words were exactly right, respectful, complimentary, acknowledging both my role in Daniel's life and his value as a person. But something in her delivery felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this introduction until it sounded natural while remaining strategically calculated. Still, I was genuinely happy that Daniel had found someone who made him smile again after the devastation of Rebecca's abandonment, and I was determined to welcome anyone who brought joy back into my son's life. "Please come in," I said, accepting the wine and noting its impressive French label. "Daniel's been so excited about tonight. He says you work in pharmaceutical marketing?" "Senior marketing director at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals," Cassandra corrected, with a smile that was warm but contained just enough precision to ensure I understood her professional status. "We develop strategic campaigns for breakthrough medications. It's challenging work, but incredibly rewarding when you know your efforts are helping bring life-changing treatments to patients who need them." Life-changing treatments. Strategic. Campaigns. Even her job description was crafted to sound both impressive and altruistic, positioning her as someone who did well by doing good. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated answer that would appeal to Daniel's desire to build a life with someone whose work had meaning beyond just generating income. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, where he'd been helping Emma and Sophia with their homework, a Tuesday evening routine that had become sacred in our household. He looked nervous but excited, clearly eager for his mother and his new girlfriend to appreciate each other and form the kind of relationship that would allow him to integrate the different parts of his life seamlessly. "Mom, you remember I told you about Cassandra? She's the one who suggested that amazing restaurant where we had dinner last weekend." Amazing restaurant. I filed away the reference to expensive dining experiences. Another small indicator that Cassandra's lifestyle expectations might be considerably more elevated than what Daniel's insurance adjuster salary could comfortably support. But maybe that was unfair speculation. Successful professional women were entitled to enjoy fine dining, and Daniel was certainly capable of budgeting for occasional luxury experiences. "What a lovely home," Cassandra observed, surveying our comfortable but decidedly modest living space with the kind of careful attention that suggested professional assessment rather than casual interest. "So warm and lived in. You can really feel the history here, all the memories that have been made in these rooms." History, memories. The phrasing was interesting, acknowledging the emotional significance of our family home while subtly emphasizing its age and the accumulation of time rather than its current vitality or future potential. It was the kind of comment that sounded appreciative while actually being faintly dismissive, though perhaps I was reading too much into word choices that might have been entirely innocent. Dinner conversation revealed Cassandra to be intelligent, well-informed, and strategically engaging. She asked thoughtful questions about my interior design background, expressed appropriate interest in Emma and Sophia's school activities, and demonstrated genuine curiosity about Daniel's career goals and professional development. But I found myself studying her responses, noting how carefully she modulated her reactions to present herself in the most favorable light possible. When I mentioned the community center project Daniel had recently completed, Cassandra's response was particularly revealing. How wonderful that you can choose projects based on personal passion rather than purely financial considerations, she said with apparent admiration. It must be liberating to have reached a point in your career where you can prioritize meaningful work over maximum compensation. The comment was ostensibly positive, but it contained several subtle implications that troubled me. First, the assumption that community service work was a luxury Daniel could afford rather than a responsibility he embraced. Second, the suggestion that meaningful work and maximum compensation were mutually exclusive rather than potentially compatible goals. Third, the implication that Daniel's current career approach was somehow temporary or transitional, rather than a deliberate choice about how to build a purposeful professional life. When Daniel talked enthusiastically about his plans to expand his community development consulting, Cassandra nodded supportively while asking pointed questions about market potential, scalability, and revenue optimization. Have you considered developing a systematic approach that could be implemented across multiple municipalities? She suggested. There might be significant opportunities to build a consulting practice around community development methodologies. Systematic approach, multiple municipalities, consulting practice. Cassandra was unconsciously reshaping Daniel's language and conceptual framework, moving him away from thinking about individual community needs toward thinking about business, opportunities, and professional advancement strategies. I watched Daniel begin to adopt her vocabulary, talking about scaling impact and sustainable business models, instead of simply helping communities solve practical problems. The shift was subtle but significant. He was beginning to view his work through the lens of professional optimization rather than community service. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Cassandra's attention was drawn to our family photo collection. She studied each picture with apparent interest, asking about family history and commenting on how Daniel had grown and changed over the years. "You were such a serious little boy," she observed, looking at a photo of 10-year-old Daniel helping me paint a client's living room during one of his school vacation weeks. "Even then, you looked like you were thinking about big ideas and important projects." He was always thoughtful, I agreed. Daniel cared deeply about doing good work and making meaningful contributions, even as a child. "That's so endearing," Cassandra said, but I noticed she'd moved on to a more recent photo. Daniel at his college graduation, looking confident and accomplished in his cap and gown. "This is more how I picture you now, successful, professional, ready to make a real impact in your field." The comment seemed innocent enough, but it subtly divided Daniel's life into charming childhood and serious adulthood, suggesting that caring about community service and family contributions were childish qualities to be outgrown rather than adult virtues to be preserved and developed. As the evening progressed, I began to understand that Cassandra wasn't just getting to know our family. She was conducting a careful assessment of how we fit into whatever vision she had for her future with Daniel. Every question, every observation, every compliment seemed designed to gather information that would help her understand what elements of Daniel's current life were compatible with her plans and which might need to be modified or eliminated. When they prepared to leave, Cassandra helped clear dishes and complimented the meal with specific details that showed she'd been paying careful attention. The salmon was perfectly prepared, and that dessert recipe is definitely something I'd love to learn. Daniel is so fortunate to have grown up with this level of culinary sophistication. I'd be happy to share the recipe, I offered, hoping to build a connection with this woman who was clearly important to my son. "That's so generous," Cassandra replied. "Though with my schedule at Pinnacle, I'm afraid I'm more of a takeout and delivery person these days. Maybe once my current project launches and things settle down." It was a polite deflection, declining my offer while making it seem like a temporary scheduling issue rather than a fundamental lack of interest. But the message was clear. She wasn't planning to learn my recipes because she wasn't planning to cook family meals. That wasn't part of her vision for her life with Daniel. After they left, I sat in my living room washing coffee cups and trying to process my mixed feelings about Cassandra. Daniel was clearly infatuated. He'd watched her all evening with the kind of attention that suggested he was still in the honeymoon phase of romantic discovery. She was undeniably intelligent, successful, and sophisticated in ways that I could understand would appeal to a man ready to build a serious adult relationship. But something about her presence had made me feel diminished, as if my comfortable life and modest accomplishments were being measured against different standards and found wanting. It wasn't anything she'd said directly. Her words had been consistently appropriate and kind. It was more about what she'd chosen to focus on, what she'd valued, what she'd seemed to see as worth preserving versus what she'd apparently dismissed as outdated or irrelevant. Over the following weeks, Cassandra became a regular presence in Daniel's life and, by extension, in our household routines. She joined us for Sunday dinners, accompanied Daniel to Emma and Sophia's school events, and gradually established herself as someone who belonged in our family circle. On the surface, her integration appeared seamless. She was always polite, always appropriately dressed, always armed with thoughtful hostess gifts and intelligent conversation. But I began noticing subtle changes in Daniel during this period. Small shifts in his language and priorities that seemed to align with Cassandra's worldview rather than the values he'd always expressed. When I mentioned a news story about a local family struggling with housing costs, Daniel's response was different than it would have been 6 months earlier. Instead of immediately thinking about community resources that might help or advocacy strategies that could address systemic issues, his first reaction was analysis of market forces and economic trends that had created their situation. "It's really a supply and demand problem," he'd observe, sounding like he was quoting something he'd read rather than expressing his own thoughts. "Until we address the fundamental economic drivers of housing costs, individual interventions are just temporary fixes that don't scale to meaningful impact." Supply and demand. Fundamental economic drivers. Interventions that don't scale. This was Cassandra's vocabulary, her analytical framework, being adopted by Daniel as if it represented more sophisticated thinking than his previous focus on practical help for specific families in crisis. When our neighbor Mrs. Patterson asked Daniel to help with a small home repair project, the kind of favor he'd always been happy to provide, his response reflected new calculations about time management and opportunity costs. "I'd love to help, Mrs. Patterson," he'd said, "but I'm working on developing some consulting proposals that could really expand my professional opportunities. Maybe I could recommend a reliable contractor instead." Consulting proposals. Professional opportunities. Daniel was beginning to view community relationships as optional activities that competed with more important career development priorities, rather than as fundamental responsibilities of being a good neighbor and family member. When local nonprofits reached out for volunteer assistance with projects Daniel had previously supported enthusiastically, he started declining requests that he'd once accepted automatically. "I need to be more strategic about my volunteer commitments," he'd explain when I asked about his reduced community involvement. "Cassandra's helped me understand that saying yes to everything means I can't excel at anything. It's better to focus my energy on a few high-impact opportunities rather than spreading myself too thin across multiple small projects." Strategic volunteer commitments, high-impact opportunities. These phrases sounded professional and thoughtful, but they represented a fundamental shift from seeing community service as a natural expression of family values to viewing it as a career development strategy that needed to be optimized for maximum professional benefit. The changes weren't dramatic enough to constitute obvious betrayal of his character, and individually they seemed reasonable or even admirable. Who could argue with being more strategic about time management, more analytical about complex social problems, or more focused on professional development. But collectively, they represented Daniel's gradual adoption of Cassandra's worldview, one that prioritized individual advancement over community contribution, strategic thinking over generous instincts, and professional optimization over family loyalty. Cassandra's influence became more apparent during the holiday season. Daniel had always loved our family Christmas traditions, the elaborate meal we prepared together, the evening of caroling in our neighborhood, the practice of choosing gifts that reflected deep knowledge of the recipient rather than impressive price tags. These traditions weren't sophisticated or Instagram-worthy, but they were ours, saturated with decades of shared history and meaning. You know, Cassandra mentioned casually during our December meal planning conversation, Daniel and I received an invitation to the Riverside Pharmaceutical Association's holiday gala this year. It's a really significant networking opportunity. All the region's major pharmaceutical executives will be there, along with key clients and potential business partners. The gala was scheduled for December 23rd, the same evening we'd planned. Our traditional Christmas Eve preparation, cooking together, wrapping final gifts, attending midnight services at our family church. It was the most sacred evening of our holiday calendar, the culmination of weeks of anticipation and shared preparation. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, I said carefully. What time does it start? Maybe you could stop by here first, or join us afterward for our traditional celebrations. Cassandra's smile was sympathetic but firm. Unfortunately, these industry events run quite late, and there are usually after-parties with the most important networking opportunities. We'd probably need to make it our primary Christmas commitment if Daniel wants to make the right impression on people who could really advance his career. Primary Christmas commitment. The language was revealing. Cassandra wasn't asking Daniel to choose between two social events. She was asking him to choose between his family's traditions and his professional advancement, between honoring his past and building his future. Daniel looked torn, glancing between Cassandra and me with obvious discomfort. Maybe we could do both somehow. Stop by the gala for the networking component, then come back here for our family traditions? Darling, Cassandra said, the endearment carrying a subtle note of correction. You can't really build meaningful professional relationships if people know you're planning to leave early. It sends the wrong message about your priorities and your commitment to advancing your career in the pharmaceutical consulting field. Professional relationships, wrong message about priorities. Cassandra was framing the choice as being about Daniel's professional seriousness, rather than about what our family meant to him. She was making it impossible for him to choose family without seeming unprofessional and unambitious. Mom would understand, Daniel said, looking at me with appeal in his eyes. Wouldn't you, Mom? This could be really important for establishing the consulting practice I've been planning. What could I say? That I didn't understand? That his consulting practice shouldn't matter more than Christmas Eve with his family? That Cassandra was manipulating him into abandoning traditions that had sustained our family for decades? Of course I understand, I said, because that's what mothers do. We make it easy for our children to break our hearts if that's what they think they need to do for their happiness and success. Career opportunities are important, and you should take advantage of connections that could help build your future. But even as I said the words, I felt something fundamental shift in our family dynamic. Daniel attended the pharmaceutical gala, leaving Emma, Sophia, and me to spend Christmas Eve without him for the first time in their young lives. He called twice, once to check if we were okay, once to share excitement about meeting several influential pharmaceutical executives who'd expressed interest in his community development expertise. His voice was animated in a way I hadn't heard since before. Rebecca's abandonment, and I tried to feel happy that he was excited about professional opportunities, even though his excitement seemed to require our exclusion from his most important evening. Cassandra's transformation of Daniel accelerated after the holidays. She began involving him in her social circle, young professionals who measured success by income and possessions, who talked about careers as if they were competitive sports, who seemed to view personal relationships as strategic alliances rather than sources of meaning and support. "You should meet Cassandra's colleagues," Daniel told me after one of their networking gatherings. "They're all so accomplished, so focused on building something significant with their professional lives. It's inspiring to be around people who think systematically about career advancement and wealth building." Thinking systematically about career advancement, wealth building. Daniel was beginning to sound like he was reading from a business development textbook rather than expressing his own values and aspirations. The most significant change was in how Daniel talked about our family's financial situation and living arrangements. For 3 years, he'd been genuinely grateful for the opportunity to live in my guest house while rebuilding his life after Rebecca's abandonment. He'd understood that the arrangement benefited everyone. He got stable housing and childcare support, while Emma and Sophia got a close relationship with their grandmother, and I got the joy of being involved in their daily lives. But Cassandra began introducing subtle questions about independence, financial optimization, and the appearance of success that living with family might project to professional contacts. "Not that there's anything wrong with multi-generational living," she'd say during conversations about their future plans. "But at some point, successful professionals need to establish their own households and demonstrate their ability to manage independent financial responsibilities." Successful professionals, independent financial responsibilities. Cassandra was reframing Daniel's gratitude for family support as dependence that might compromise his professional credibility. "Daniel's clearly capable of supporting his own household," she'd continue. "And I think potential consulting clients would be more impressed by someone who's established his own successful domestic situation, rather than someone who's still living in family housing." Potential consulting clients, successful domestic situation. She was making Daniel's living arrangement sound like a professional liability rather than a family blessing, a sign of immaturity rather than evidence of close family bonds. Daniel began talking about transitioning to independent living and establishing a proper family home, as if our current arrangement was temporary emergency housing rather than a deliberate choice about family priorities and mutual support. "Cassandra's right that I should probably be thinking about buying my own place," he'd mentioned during our Sunday planning sessions. "Emma and Sophia are getting older, and they need space to grow. Plus, if I'm going to build a serious consulting practice, I should probably have a proper home office and space for entertaining potential clients." Emma and Sophia needed space to grow, proper home office, space for entertaining. These were reasonable considerations, but they represented a complete reversal of Daniel's previous understanding that family proximity was valuable, that shared resources benefited everyone, and that professional success didn't require social isolation from the people who loved him. By the spring of 2020, Daniel was talking seriously about house hunting, though his budget calculations seemed divorced from the reality of his actual income and savings. Insurance adjusting paid well enough to support a comfortable lifestyle, but it didn't generate the kind of income that would qualify for mortgages on the properties Cassandra was encouraging him to consider. "We've been looking at houses in the Riverside district," Daniel would report after spending weekends touring properties with Cassandra. "There are some beautiful colonials that would be perfect for entertaining and establishing the kind of professional image that attracts high-end consulting clients. Riverside district, beautiful colonials, professional image." Daniel was shopping for houses based on their capacity to impress Cassandra's social circle rather than their suitability for his actual family needs and financial capabilities. "Have you calculated what the monthly payments would be on properties in that price range?" I'd ask, trying to inject practical reality into conversations that seemed dominated by aspirational thinking. "We're working with a mortgage broker who specializes in professional loans," Daniel would respond. "She says, there are programs for people with strong earning potential who just need help with the initial qualification requirements. Professional loans, strong earning potential, Daniel was being encouraged to borrow against future income that might never materialize, to commit to mortgage payments that would strain his budget even if his consulting practice succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. But my concerns about financial overextension paled in comparison to my worry about the fundamental changes in Daniel's character and priorities. The grateful son who'd understood that family support was a blessing was becoming someone who saw that same support as a limitation on his independence and professional credibility. The generous man who'd always been eager to help others was becoming someone who calculated the professional benefits of his volunteer commitments. The family-focused father who'd prioritized Emma and Sophia's emotional security was becoming someone who made major life decisions based on their capacity to impress Cassandra's colleagues. Most troubling, the son who'd always valued my input and included me in important decisions was becoming someone who presented me with conclusions rather than seeking my advice, who talked about our family's future as if it were his individual property to manage rather than our shared responsibility to nurture. When Daniel and Cassandra announced their engagement in December 2020, I was genuinely happy for them despite my concerns about the changes I'd witnessed in my son. Daniel deserved love and partnership, and if Cassandra made him happy, then I wanted to support their relationship and help them build a successful marriage. But the engagement announcement came with immediate discussions about wedding planning that revealed the extent to which Cassandra's vision of their future had already been determined without significant input from Daniel or consideration of our family's traditions and preferences. "We're thinking about a spring wedding at the Riverside Country Club," Cassandra announced during the dinner where they shared their engagement news. "My family has been members there for 3 generations, and it's really the perfect venue for the kind of elegant ceremony that reflects our professional status and social connections." Riverside Country Club. Professional status, social connections. The wedding was being planned as a social debut rather than a celebration of love, a business networking event rather than a family gathering. "That sounds lovely," I said. Though, privately I wondered how Daniel planned to afford a reception at one of the city's most expensive venues. "Have you thought about the guest list? I'd love to help you plan something that includes all the people who've been important in your lives." "Actually," Cassandra said, "we're planning a relatively intimate celebration, mainly family and close. Professional associates. The club has capacity restrictions, and we want to keep the guest list focused on people who are genuinely significant in our current lives, rather than trying to include everyone we've ever known." People who are genuinely significant in our current lives. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Our family's friends, Daniel's community connections, and the extended network of relationships that had sustained him through difficult times were not considered genuinely significant in the context of his new life with Cassandra. When I offered to contribute to wedding expenses, a traditional gesture that would also ensure our family had input into planning decisions, Cassandra graciously declined while explaining their preference for maintaining control over all aspects of their celebration. "That's so generous, Eleanor, but Daniel and I really want this to be our gift to each other," she said. "We've been saving carefully, and we want the wedding to reflect our own taste and planning, rather than compromising our vision to accommodate multiple opinions about how things should be done." Our own taste. Our vision. Multiple opinions. Cassandra was positioning family input as interference rather than support, financial contributions as attempts to control rather than expressions of love and investment in their happiness. The year of wedding planning that followed was a masterclass in how Cassandra gradually isolated Daniel from family traditions while making the process seem like natural evolution toward a more sophisticated lifestyle. Every decision was presented as an upgrade from our family's previous approaches. More elegant venues instead of the community spaces where we'd always celebrated. Professional services instead of family contributions. Expensive excellence instead of homemade love. "We're using the same wedding planner who coordinated the governor's daughter's wedding," Cassandra would mention when describing their planning process. She really understands how to create events that make the right impression on influential guests. The same wedding planner. The right impression. Influential guests. Even their wedding planner was chosen based on her capacity to enhance their social credibility, rather than her ability to create a celebration that reflected their actual relationship and values. When Daniel asked me to help Emma and Sophia prepare for their roles as flower girls, I was thrilled to be included in their special day. But even this family contribution was managed through Cassandra's specifications rather than collaborative planning that honored our family's traditions and preferences. The girls need to look absolutely perfect, Cassandra explained when outlining the requirements for their flower girl preparation. This wedding is going to be photographed extensively, and those images will be part of our family history forever. Everything needs to be flawless. Photographed extensively. Family history. Forever. Everything needs to be flawless. Cassandra was approaching their wedding as a performance to be documented rather than a celebration to be enjoyed, a social investment rather than an expression of love. By the time their wedding day arrived, Daniel had been so thoroughly transformed by Cassandra's influence that the man walking down the aisle bore only superficial resemblance to the grateful, family-focused son I'd raised. He looked successful and confident, every inch the accomplished professional that Cassandra had helped him become. But he'd also become someone who could introduce his mother as just the babysitter who helps out with the kids, without apparent recognition of what he was saying or whom he was dismissing. The catalyst had arrived, and the transformation was complete. Daniel had gained access to Cassandra's sophisticated social world, but he'd lost touch with the values and relationships that had made him a man worth loving in the first place. Now, he was about to learn what happens when you trade genuine treasures for impressive appearances, when you exchange authentic relationships for strategic alliances, when you forget that the foundation of your success was built by people whose love you've taken for granted. Cassandra had gotten exactly what she'd wanted, a husband who was willing to abandon his family's values in pursuit of her vision of professional and social success. But she was about to discover that some foundations, once destroyed, take everything built on top of them down as well. The morning after Daniel's wedding, I sat in my small guest house kitchen drinking coffee and making phone calls that would change everything. But to understand the full impact of what I was about to unleash, you need to see how Daniel's public humiliation of me was actually the inevitable conclusion of a process that had been building for 2 years under Cassandra's influence. When Daniel stood at his wedding reception and introduced me as just the babysitter who helps out with the kids, he wasn't making a mistake or suffering a moment of poor judgment. He was expressing his authentic view of my role in his life, a view that Cassandra had systematically cultivated through strategic manipulation and gradual isolation from family values. The grateful son who'd once understood that family was treasure had become someone who saw family as service providers. The generous man who'd always prioritized others' welfare had become someone who calculated relationships based on their professional utility. The family-focused father who'd built his identity around caring for Emma and Sophia had become someone who measured success by his ability to impress strangers, rather than nurture the people who loved him. But what Daniel didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to investigate, was that the babysitter he'd just publicly humiliated owned not only the house where he was living, but a comprehensive support system that had made his entire lifestyle possible. The first call I made was to Patricia Caldwell, my former business manager, who now ran the expanded version of Hartwell Interiors. "Eleanor, how was the wedding?" Patricia's voice was warm with genuine interest. "Eventful," I replied. "Patricia, I'm calling because I've decided to return to active business development. I'm interested in opportunities that would allow me to work with people who appreciate expertise and treat professionals with appropriate respect." "That's wonderful news," Patricia said immediately. "What kind of ventures are you considering?" I'm thinking about real estate development projects that could provide high-quality housing while generating substantial returns, I explained. I have some capital available for investment, and I think there might be opportunities to build something meaningful. The second call was to Linda Torres, who managed my rental property portfolio and had extensive connections throughout the local real estate market. "Eleanor, what perfect timing," Linda said. "I've been reviewing your portfolio performance, and you're in an incredibly strong position to expand your holdings if you're interested in active investing again." "Actually, Linda, I'm calling about a specific property," I said. "I need to understand the current market value and rental potential for 847 Riverside Heights Drive." There was a pause. "That's your son's house, isn't it? The colonial you purchased through HL Property Holdings?" "Yes," I confirmed. "I need current market analysis and recommendations for how to optimize that asset's performance." "Well," Linda said carefully, "comparable properties in that neighborhood are selling for $1.4 to $1.5 million, so you're sitting on significant appreciation. For rental, a house like that could easily command $4,500 to $5,200 monthly, depending on how it's positioned in the market. $4,500 to $5,200 monthly. The house Daniel thought he owned could generate more rental income than his entire monthly salary from Hartwell Insurance." By noon, I had a clear picture of my options. Daniel was living in a house worth $1.4 million that could generate $60,000 annually in rental income. He was making mortgage payments on a loan I'd essentially co-signed, living in a property I owned, raising his children in security I'd provided, all while introducing me as just the babysitter to 200 wedding guests. The paperwork took 3 weeks to complete. Converting Daniel's owned home to a rental property required careful legal coordination, but the process was straightforward since I'd never actually transferred ownership to him, only provided financing that made his residence possible through a lease-to-own agreement with specific conditions. The eviction notice was served on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after Daniel's wedding, by a professional process server who handed Daniel an official document explaining that his lease agreement was being terminated and he had 30 days to vacate the premises. "There must be some mistake," Daniel told the process server, his voice confused and panicked. "I own this house. I have a mortgage, property tax bills, homeowner's insurance. This isn't a rental property." The process server simply pointed to the legal documentation. "Sir, according to county records, this property is owned by HL Property Holdings. Your mortgage is actually a rental agreement with purchase option, and that option is being revoked due to lease violations." The explanation was simple. I'd structured the transaction as a lease-to-own agreement that gave Daniel the option to purchase the property after meeting certain conditions, including maintaining respectful relationships with all family members and demonstrating appropriate gratitude for financial assistance received. By introducing me as just the babysitter at his wedding reception, Daniel had violated the respect clause of his occupancy agreement. The purchase option was revoked, the lease was terminated, and he had 30 days to vacate my property. When Daniel called me, his voice was shaking with disbelief and desperation. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Someone served me with eviction papers for my own house. They're saying you own it, that I'm just a tenant. That can't be right." "It's absolutely right, Daniel," I replied calmly. "I purchased 847 Riverside Heights Drive as an investment property and allowed you to live there under a lease agreement that included behavioral conditions. You violated those conditions." "What behavioral conditions? What are you talking about?" "The condition that you treat family members with respect and acknowledge the support that makes your lifestyle possible. When you introduced me as just the babysitter at your wedding reception, you demonstrated that you no longer understand the difference between family and hired help." There was a long silence. "Mom, that was just... I was nervous. There were so many people. I didn't mean anything by it." "Daniel, you weren't nervous. You were embarrassed by me. You wanted to impress Cassandra's friends by minimizing your mother's role in your life. You succeeded. They all think I'm domestic staff. Now you can explain to them why the domestic staff owns your house. Please, Mom. I'm sorry. I made a mistake, but you can't throw us out of our home. Emma and Sophia live here. Emma and Sophia. We'll be fine. They're resilient children who've survived much worse than moving to a smaller house. As for your home, you built it on a foundation you never bothered to understand or appreciate. What do you want me to do? I'll apologize publicly. I'll tell everyone who you really are. I'll make this right somehow. It's too late for apologies, Daniel. You can't unring a bell, and you can't take back showing 200 people that you're the kind of man who dismisses his mother as hired help. Then what? What happens now? Now you learn what it costs to underestimate people, I said. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. I'll be converting the property to a luxury rental that will generate enough income to fund my return to active business development. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Cassandra's marriage imploded with spectacular public embarrassment. When Cassandra discovered that their beautiful house was actually owned by the elderly woman she'd encouraged Daniel to minimize and dismiss, her reaction was swift and brutal. "You lied to me," she screamed during the argument that neighbors described as audible 3 houses away. "You let me plan our entire wedding around a house you don't even own. You let me invite my parents, my colleagues, everyone important to my career, to celebrate success that was completely fake." "I didn't know," Daniel pleaded. "I thought we owned it. I thought the mortgage payments meant—" "You thought? Daniel, you're supposed to be a professional. How do you not know whether you own your own house? My mother structured it in a way that made it seem— Your mother, the babysitter, the woman you've been telling me was just helping with childcare. She owns our house?" The fight continued for hours, with Cassandra alternately furious about being deceived and horrified about being financially dependent on the woman she'd spent 2 years teaching Daniel to dismiss. By morning, she'd called her father to discuss divorce proceedings. "My daughter married you because she believed you were a successful, independent man," Robert Montgomery told Daniel during their final conversation. "Instead, you've made our entire family look foolish by building your life on borrowed money and family charity." Cassandra filed for divorce 6 weeks after their wedding, citing irreconcilable differences and financial misrepresentation. The settlement required Daniel to assume all wedding-related debts and moving expenses. By the time everything was settled, Daniel had lost his house, his wife, his savings, and his professional reputation in Cassandra's social circle. 3 months. After losing his house, Daniel appeared at my guest house door on a rainy Tuesday evening, looking like he'd aged 10 years in as many weeks. Emma and Sophia were with him, carrying small overnight bags and wearing expressions of cautious hope. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something, and I understand if the answer is no." "What do you need, Daniel?" "I need to know if there's any chance. If you could ever forgive me enough to let us come home. Not to the big house. I know I lost the right to that. But here, to the guest house, where we were actually happy." I looked at my son, this broken man who'd learned too late the difference between having things and being loved, between impressing strangers and honoring family. "Daniel, you can't just apologize your way back to the relationship we had before. Too much has been damaged. Too much trust has been broken." "I know. I'm not asking for things to be the same. I'm asking for a chance to earn your forgiveness and prove that I've learned from the worst mistake of my life." "What have you learned?" "I've learned that everything good in my life came from your love and support. I've learned that success without family is just expensive loneliness. I've learned that the people who love you unconditionally are treasures you can't afford to lose." I looked at my granddaughters, who were watching this conversation with serious attention. "Emma, Sophia," I said, kneeling down to their eye level, "do you want to come home?" Yes, please, Grandma Eleanor, Emma said immediately. We missed you so much. We're sorry Daddy was mean to you at the wedding, Sophia added. We told him. He should have said you're the best grandma in the world. I stood up and looked at Daniel again. You can stay in the guest house while you rebuild your life. But there are conditions. Anything. First, you'll contribute to household expenses based on your actual income. Second, you'll participate in family responsibilities as an equal partner. Third, you'll be honest with Emma and Sophia about money and relationships. And fourth, you'll start therapy to understand how you became someone who could dismiss his mother as hired help. Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face. Mom, I don't deserve this chance, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what I almost lost. You're right. You don't deserve it, I agreed. But Emma and Sophia deserve a stable home with family who love them, and I deserve the chance to watch my son become the man I raised him to be. That was 18 months ago. Today, Daniel lives in my guest house with Emma and Sophia, paying rent and contributing to our household in ways that honor our partnership. He's completed a year of therapy and is rebuilding his relationship with his daughters based on honesty, rather than image management. As for me, I've used the rental income from 847 Riverside Heights Drive, which now generates $5,200 monthly from a pharmaceutical executive who appreciates quality housing, to fund a return to real estate development. Hartwell Properties now owns 6 rental units and is developing affordable housing projects that create value for working families. The most satisfying aspect isn't the financial success. It's knowing that I built something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal, that I transformed public humiliation into private triumph, and that I taught my son the most expensive lesson of his life, while ultimately saving him from a marriage that would have destroyed his authentic self. The babysitter he dismissed at his wedding reception turned out to own everything he thought was his. But more importantly, she turned out to love him enough to take it all away when that's what he needed to remember who he really was. Daniel learned that some mistakes are too expensive to undo, but not too expensive to learn from. He discovered that family isn't something you graduate from, but something you return to when you're wise enough to understand its value. Emma and Sophia call me Grandma Eleanor again, not because they have to, but because they want to. Daniel introduces me as his mother, the successful entrepreneur who taught him everything he knows about building businesses that serve communities. And every Tuesday morning, we have breakfast together in my kitchen, not because I'm providing childcare services, but because we're family, and family takes care of each other through good times and bad, through success and failure, through pride and humility. Sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one that teaches you what's actually priceless. Daniel learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it completely, and that makes everything we went through worth it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.